Welcome to another episode of Pizza Class. In today's episode, we're going to talk about baker's percentage. Baker's percentage is a way designed by bakers to measure accurately their ingredients so that they can share ingredients with one another, perform experiments on their own dough recipes, and also scale their recipes for batches that are larger than one pie at a time. So baker's percentage can be a really useful tool for the home pizza baker. So I'm going to take you through the steps that you use to figure out how to change your recipe from a traditional measurement to a baker's percentage recipe. And then you'll learn how to use that to scale your recipe as well. So I hope you find this useful. Let's jump right in. Okay, so strap on your math hat. We're going to jump right into what is baker's percentage. So baker's percentage is basically a method that bakers have come up with as a way to show your dough ingredients as a percent of the flour weight. It actually is a very simple and easy to read way to express dough recipes, and it's sometimes referred to as baker's math because there is a little bit of math involved. And in fact, before we get started, you should know that a lot of this math can be done in a spreadsheet or with a dough calculator tool, and that's the easiest way, but we're going to show you the manual way just so you understand what's happening in the method. So let's start by saying once you get the hang of it, you're going to love it. So why would you want to use baker's percentage? Well, there are a handful of very important advantages to speaking about your dough recipes with baker's percentage. The first thing is that measuring by weight is always the most precise way. Using mass, using grams or ounces is the best way to measure your ingredients. And that's because with dry ingredients in particular, you could use volumetric measurements like half cup, and you could pack that half cup measuring cup differently each time. So whether there's a little bit of a slight mound on your cup or whether you packed it too much, that could radically affect the outcome in your recipe, especially in small batches, which we often are making with pizza. So you want to use weight because it's the most precise method, and you'll get the same amount of ingredients every single time, and that can become critical. Secondly, it allows you to scale your recipes up or down. So if you're in the situation where maybe you have a recipe that you got from a friend or from online and you wanted to try that recipe in a larger batch, or maybe you even just want to take the batch that you usually make, maybe a dough ball or two, and you want to make 10 dough balls, you need to have a way to easily scale that recipe, and baker's percentage gives you a great opportunity to do that. You also might come across a scenario where you're trying to scale a recipe down. So maybe you found a recipe online that is for a restaurant, or maybe you have a restaurant and you're trying to make a smaller batch of your normal dough to experiment with, and so scaling down with baker's percentage recipes is much, much simpler. And I'll show you a little bit of that as well. Thirdly, it creates a common language for bakers. So if you've ever tried to share a dough recipe, it can be very challenging because of the fact that everyone measures their recipe slightly different, whereas if you use baker's percentage, then I can give you a recipe, you immediately know how to use that recipe and how to scale it, and you can get to weights from that percentage every single time. So it creates kind of a common language for bakers to share recipes. And then lastly, I think it's terrific for facilitating experimentation. So if you've gotten into making pizza at home and you're getting serious about it, you're going to want to tweak your recipes and even tweak the recipes that I share in the course. So to do that, baker's percentage makes it easy by allowing you to adjust your percentages and not just say, well, what happens if I add an extra half cup of flour? That can be a little bit haphazard and in fact can get you into trouble. Whereas if you use a percentage, let's take water hydration, for example. It's very common in pizza dough to mess with your hydration to control the consistency of your dough. So if I create a recipe and provide it to you for 65% hydration and you decide your dough is too wet, you would want to scale back your water by some percentage. So you may want to try a 60% hydration dough, and baker's percentage allows you to do that without messing up the rest of your recipe. So you'll want to, when you begin experimenting, you'll want to go to baker's percentages. It's worth the extra effort in learning the technique. So what are the rules for baker's percentage? Let me just cover some ground rules. The first one is always all ingredients are measured by weight. So You can use grams or you can use ounces, but it has to be a mass measurement, so you're going to need a scale for this. And a good scale that's digital will help you out a lot. In fact, some scales actually allow Baker's percentage calculators to happen right on the scale. So the scale that I show in my other courses would actually allow you to do that. So once you measure your flour, you can measure the rest of your ingredients as a percent of the original flour weight, which is very handy and convenient. But you want to use weight, you want to use grams or ounces. In all the examples, I'm going to use grams today because I feel like it's easier to do math in grams than it is to do math in ounces. Secondly, flour is always set to 100% of the weight. That just means you weigh your flour, and then your flour is 100%. Everything else is a lower percentage of 100, and I'll show you how that works. But for now, just make sure you know all flour is always set to 100% weight. If you have more than one type of flour in a recipe, for advanced recipes, the flour all adds up to be 100% every time. So if you have flour type A and flour type B, they need to add together to be 100% of the recipe weight. And I'll explain that'll make sense as we get into the method. So, thirdly, all other ingredients are expressed as a percent of that flour weight. So water is expressed as a percent of the flour weight. So the weight of the flour is a percentage of the overall flour weight. That'll make sense in a minute. Sounds simple, right? Those are the ground rules. Let's get into a few other points. When you begin to measure things up, you want to make sure that you don't think of this like typical math of 100%. So all the ingredients come together and they form, when you add them up, 100%. That's not how it works. They don't add up to 100%. You can't do it that way. To help you think about this mathematically and get your head around it, what I suggest is that you think of it instead like a bar chart, where the flour is 100% of the mass of the flour is 100%, and then the water weight is 65% of that, so you can see that it is less than the flour weight by 65%. Salt 2%, yeast 1%, and so forth. So you're always measuring against the flour weight, and it makes more sense if you think of it visually this way. So let's go through a couple of examples. The first example I want to share with you is how to convert a normal recipe into a mass recipe. So let's say you inherit Uncle Joey's secret pizza dough recipe, and it looks like this. 3½ cups of pizza flour, 1 1/8 cup of warm water, 2 teaspoons of salt, 1 teaspoon of sugar, and 1 teaspoon of active dry yeast. Well, how do we get that to Baker's percentages so that we can scale this recipe, or we can share it with someone who will, or we just want to make it the same way every single time? Well, the way you do that is to start with adding in approximate cup weights. So you can find these online, but I have most of the common ones here. This is just basically telling you that 1 cup of high gluten flour generally weighs 120 grams. Now, if you want to weigh your own flour, you can do that. You can put your 1 cup of flour on your scale and see how many grams it weighs, and keep that as your number for conversion from now on, because it does vary slightly by the manufacturer of the flour. And if you want to get super scientific about this, you can look up those values by the manufacturer of the flour. But here's a good weight, 120 grams per cup for high gluten flour should be good for most of your recipes. Same with water. That's a scientific stated fact that water weighs 236.6 grams per cup. So you'll always use that number. Salt and sugar, they'll be somewhere between 200 and 300 grams per cup. Again, I have those here. Olive oil might vary slightly by manufacturer, but 216 grams per cup is a good estimate. Active dry yeast and instant dry yeast are slightly, active dry yeast is slightly lighter because it has less hydration, so you can see that I've got those numbers there as well. So this tells you that for 1 cup of those ingredients, you can see the corresponding weight in mass in grams here. You'll use that in your conversion. So let's show you how that works. Uncle Joey's secret pizza dough recipe. We've got 3.5 cups of pizza flour, 1 1/8 or 1.125 cups of water, 2 teaspoons of a cup. Converted to cups is 0.02 times 2. A teaspoon is 0.02 cups, and you can see so on down the list. So first I converted everything to cups. And next I'm going to multiply by my grams per cup. So those are the factors from the previous slide that I showed you. and we multiply those together to get our pizza flour weight, which is 3.5 times 120 grams is 420 grams of flour. So there we have on the far right column, we have Uncle Joey's secret pizza dough recipe, but now it's in mass measurements and not volumetric measurements, which is going to be very important. So let's say we want to make this into a baker's percentage recipe. Well, we've got our mass weighed amounts, and we know how much each of those ingredients weighs for this particular pizza recipe. And we want to do some math here. So pizza flour, right off the top, that's 100% in baker's percentage language. So we always have, there's no math involved, the percentage of pizza flour is just always 100%. Now water, what you do is you take the grams of water and you divide by the grams of pizza flour. So in this case, 266 divided by 420. This is a 63% hydration pizza recipe. That's good information to have. If our dough comes out too wet, we can back off on the water grams and lower that hydration percentage. So that's a really important part to notice here. Salt and sugar, you can do the same thing. 12 grams divided by 420 grams gives you 3% salt, and 4 grams divided by 420 grams gives you 1% sugar. And active dry yeast, these are often very small numbers. In fact, with some of my recipes, I just stick to volumetric because it's hard to even measure a percentage of a percent or a decimal of a percent on a lot of scales. So if you are using a small test batch and your yeast is, very small amount, it may be difficult to weigh it. But for the sake of this math, we're going to go ahead through our experiment. 2.7 grams divided by 420 grams of flour equals 0.6% of the recipe by weight. That is active dry yeast. And there you have Uncle Joey's secret pizza dough recipe as a baker's percentage formula. And this means you can share it, you can experiment with it, just don't upset Uncle Joey. Okay, let's talk about another important example. This is where we can use baker's percentage to scale a batch of dough. So let's say we know we want to end up with 310 gram dough balls, which is about the size of a 14-inch pizza with average thickness. And let's say we want to make 3 of those, but we have a recipe that is in baker's percentage. So below you see there that our recipe is 100% flour, as it always will be. We have 60% water, we have 2% salt, 2% sugar, and 1% yeast. Now how do we get from that baker's percentage recipe to know exactly how much flour, water, salt, sugar, and yeast to weigh out on our scale so that we can have 3 dough balls that are 310 grams apiece? Well, I'm going to show you. Let's take a look at the math involved here. We're going to calculate first our total flour weight. So your flour weight is the dough ball weight times the number of dough balls you want to have times 100. And you divide all of that by the sum of all of your percentages. So we're going to show you the numbers here. We said we want our dough ball weight at the end to be 310 grams. We're going to multiply that by 3 dough balls because we want to have 3 pizzas times 100. It's always times 100 to work the math out. And then on the bottom of our equation, we're going to add up all the percentages from our recipe. So we have 100 for the flour, 60 for the water, 2 for the salt, 2 for the sugar, and 1 for the yeast. So we're going to add those numbers up. When you do that math, what you end up with is your total flour weight for your batch. In this case, we want to weigh out 563.6 grams of flour to make this batch of 3 balls of pizza. So that's really important to begin with your flour weight because that's going to kick off the rest of the weights of the ingredient when you're using baker's percentages. Let's take a look at the next step. We've got our flour weight. We've got that there as 563.6, 100% of flour. And we can apply 60% of that to get 338.2 for the batch of water. So we're going to, in our mixing bowl, we're going to have 563.6 grams of flour. We're going to weigh out 338.2 grams of water, which is simply 60% of that by mass, and so on down the list. So our salt, 11.3 grams of salt, 11.3 grams of sugar, and 5.6 grams of yeast. So our total batch weight, if you add up all those grams for the whole batch, what's left in your mixing bowl after everything has come together should weigh about 930 grams. Now you may lose a gram or two from dough sticking to the side of the mixing bowl. That's pretty common. But if you notice, if you divide 930 by 3, you'll get 310, which is 3 dough balls, each weighing 310 grams. So we have successfully used Baker's percentage to figure out exactly how much dough to make by ingredient, and our recipe should come out exactly like it did if we only made 1 dough ball, or even if we wanted to make 15 or 50 dough balls. We can use Baker's percentage to figure out exactly how much of each recipe we want to include in our mixing bowl. So that is it for Baker's percentage, and I hope that you can see how valuable this is going to be. Now, it doesn't always click right away, so go back through this episode once or twice until you understand what's happening with the math, and then try a couple of examples on your own. I also have included resources in the links for you to actually download a dough calculator or find a dough calculator online. Trust me, it makes all of this math a lot simpler, but it's really important to understand what's happening behind the scenes of the calculator so that when you have to do this, you can do this on your own. So that's it for Baker's percentage. I hope you found that useful, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Pizza Class.